In October of 1880, when the Dakota Territory was still hoping for the last gentle warmth of autumn, an unexpected blizzard swept across the land. It marked the beginning of what history would later call the Long Winter, the harshest ever recorded on the American frontier. Pioneer families, armed with nothing more than thin wooden cabins, a few meager sacks of provisions, and an unyielding will to survive, suddenly found themselves facing an impossible battle. Skin-cutting cold, endless darkness, absolute isolation, and hunger lurking at every hour. In today's story, we will step backward through time, returning to those tiny cabins standing alone in a sea of white, to uncover how these ordinary people endured a cruel winter that stretched on for more than half a year. You will hear of moments balanced between life and death, desperate journeys through the storm, quiet acts of sacrifice, and a resilience so profound that history books rarely manage to capture it. If you believe you already know what it means to be cold, hungry, or completely alone, this tale may ask you to reconsider. So let us gently open the door to the snow tomb of 1880. And walk into the unbelievable survival journey of the frontier families who lived through it. And as the door to the snow tomb of 1880 slowly opened, the first faint signs of an approaching tragedy began to appear. It did not arrive with a raging roar, nor with any clear warning from nature. It came in a cold, breathless silence, quiet yet full of foreboding, as though preparing an endless performance for the people living on the frontier. And from this very moment, our story begins. October, 1880. A morning Sarah Bennett believed would be just like any other. The gentle late autumn breeze usually carried the warm scent of dry grass, the soft rustle of leaves, and the quiet peace so characteristic of the Dakota plains. But when Sarah opened her eyes that day, the world around her no longer held the color of earth, wood, or sunlight. It had been swallowed by a muffled, lifeless white. Her family's small wooden cabin was buried beneath a thick wall of snow. Not a single ray of light slipped through. The air was dense with silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath. At that moment, Sarah had no idea that what she saw was more than unusual weather. It marked the beginning of the longest, coldest, and most merciless season the frontier families would ever endure. What shocked them most was not that snow had fallen, it was that it had fallen far too soon. October was supposed to bring the Indian summer, those last warm days meant for harvesting, storing food, and preparing for the winter ahead. But this time, nature broke every rule. In a single night, the wind shifted, the sky seemed torn open, and the snowstorm struck with a force as if trying to swallow everything in its path. Sarah remembered it clearly. Her father had jolted awake when the wind began to scream like trapped spirits howling inside the storm. The walls trembled. The door was pressed tightly shut, as though someone outside were pushing against it with all their strength. When they tried to open it the next morning, only a blast of bitter cold burst in, forcing the entire family to step back instinctively. The yard, the water well, the dirt path leading into the woods, everything had disappeared under a vast, heaving sea of snow rising nearly to the roof. A nameless fear crept quietly into their hearts. For the first time, Sarah saw unmistakable worry in her father's eyes. This was not simply an early storm. It was the warning of a winter unlike any they had known, something the meteorology of the time had no words to describe. No one realized that this would be only the first of 63 consecutive blizzards, stretching from October well into the next spring. But in that moment, Sarah could not see the future. In the eyes of a young girl living on the frontier, all she felt was unease. A deep, instinctive whisper telling her, this year will be unlike any before it. Inside the tiny cabin, worry spread like dark clouds gathering before a storm. Her mother checked every sack of flour, every pouch of beans, every jar of sugar. They had enough for a normal winter, but what about an abnormal one? No one had an answer. And it was that uncertainty, more than the cold itself, that made the family tremble. For those who lived on the frontier, harshness was no stranger. Nights cold enough to sting the skin, winds strong enough to lift a chicken coop off the ground, trails frozen solid until neither man nor horse wished to travel. But all of these were within the limits of what they understood. They had experience. They had ways to cope. But what surrounded them that morning was something else entirely. It wasn't just a colder than usual winter. It was something outside the rules, outside prediction. Outside the boundaries of what humans believed they could endure. Sarah stood by the tiny window, her breath fogging the glass. Through the narrow gaps between the wooden planks, she looked out into the blank white sky. No sun. No trees. Only an endless emptiness, as if the world had been swept clean overnight. Rising within her was a question no one dared to speak aloud. If this is only October, what will the coming months be like? Her father, trying to stay calm, grabbed a shovel and began digging a narrow path from the door to the outside, the children helping beside him, each shovelful a small defiance against despair. But the snow was so deep that every few steps they dug, the wind returned to fill the trench again. The omen of that winter was too strong to ignore. Yet, driven by the instinct of frontier folk, they held on to hope. Hope that this was merely a strange, strong storm. That the weather would settle. That the sun would return and melt the snow. But nature does not bend to human wishes. While they clung to that fragile hope, in nearby towns, the first trains were already stuck. The rails were disappearing beneath drifts. Telegraph lines were faltering. Piece by piece, the supply chain, the fragile lifeline of the Dakota settlements, was silently snapping. But Sarah's family knew none of this. They only knew that on that morning, standing inside a buried cabin, they could feel what history would record many years later. The long winter had begun. And no one could ever truly be prepared for it. That morning would haunt them for years to come, not because it changed the weather, but because it changed their fate. It turned ordinary families into silent warriors fighting for survival. It transformed peace into trial, hope into a test of endurance, and ordinary days into a brutal journey through the edge of life and death. And though it was only the beginning, that day carved into every heart a quiet fear they would carry for the next 6 months. Would they have the strength to survive this winter? They did not know. But they had no choice except to face it. And from that moment on, their true story of survival began. And then, before they could fully grasp the meaning of that first storm, before their hearts could cling to the fragile hope that the snow might stop, nature delivered its next blow, harsher and more sudden than before. If that morning had been only a warning, then the days that followed were the sentencing of the Dakota frontier. A sentence written in white, bitterly cold, and utterly merciless. And that was when our story stepped into its next chapter. When the Bennett's little wooden home was no longer a shelter, but slowly becoming a white grave. Only a few days after the first blizzard, the winds shifted again and rose with a strength that seemed capable of tearing the sky apart. Gray clouds dropped so low they felt as though they were brushing against the roof. And then, without a hint of hesitation, the snow fell, not in soft flakes, but in thick, heavy sheets, like mourning shrouds draped across the vast land. Inside the Bennett's 12 by 14-foot cabin, the silence before the storm quickly turned into the wind's frantic, unhinged howling. It blew through the gaps in the wood, shrieking in long, piercing cries like the mournful wails of the earth itself. The walls trembled rhythmically, as though absorbing invisible blows from outside. Sarah remembered that moment clearly. She had been helping her mother fasten cloths around the window frames to keep the drafts out when her father suddenly shouted from the porch. "Close the door. Quickly." The door had barely begun to swing shut when a violent gust slammed it backward, flinging snow into the center of the room. Snow was no longer falling from the sky, it was being hurled into the house like thousands of sharp, icy needles. It took every ounce of strength the family had to force the door closed again, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push its way inside. And then, the snow began to pile up. At first it was only a thin layer. Then a mound. Then a wall. Sarah's father tried to open the door to shovel it away, but within an hour the door wouldn't budge. It was pressed tight, as if a giant hand of winter were pushing it shut from the outside. When they realized they were being buried, the air inside the cabin thickened. No one spoke. Each person understood the danger without needing a single word. Once the house was fully under the snow, it would not only grow darker and colder, it could collapse at any moment beneath the immense weight. Sarah looked around. The oil lamp flickered weakly, the flame trembling like it was frightened. Its faint glow touched each face in the room, stretching long shadows across the walls. Shadows that looked like the shapes of their own swelling fears. Her mother held the children close, her voice steady only on the surface. "It's all right. We just need to wait for the storm to pass. Then we'll dig our way out." But even she knew her words were meant less for the children, and more for herself. The storm raged on for hours, then days. The Bennets soon lost any sense of day and night. From the cracks around the door and the poorly sealed walls, the wind seeped in like freezing needles against their skin. They hung blankets and carpets around the cabin to keep the warmth in, but the cold still swallowed it relentlessly. The snow rose higher. High enough to cover the windows entirely. From inside, they could no longer see sky or light, only a dense, suffocating white. The house had become a cold, dark prison. No sunlight. No sound except the wind gnawing at the walls. No way out. Every breath felt touched by frost, clinging to their lips like frozen dew. Then they realized the most frightening enemy wasn't the snow, it was time. Time spent in darkness let every anxious thought grow sharper. A single crack from the roof made the adults' hearts pound, imagining the ceiling caving in. Even a sigh seemed heavy, as though carrying the weight of the whole world. A quiet suffocation filled the cabin, not because there was no air, the snow was loose enough for that. But because the fear of being buried alive crept into every corner, every breath, every thought. Sarah remembered scraping ice from the window with her fingers and seeing nothing. Only a thick, endless white. No tree. No neighboring rooftop. No sky. She whispered. "It's like being buried underground." Her father shook his head, telling her it was just a feeling. But his eyes said something different. He knew that if the snow kept piling up, their fragile roof could snap. And in this cold, a collapsed roof wasn't just an accident, it was a death sentence. Inside their snow-entombed shelter, they faced three invisible enemies. Cold, darkness, fear. The cold stiffened their fingers, cracked their lips, drained the warmth from their bodies. The darkness stretched time into something unbearable, turning hours into slow torture. And fear seeped into every thought, every heartbeat, threatening to pull them toward despair. They lit the stove, but there wasn't much firewood left. Warmth clustered only near the hearth, while the rest of the cabin lay under a chilling layer of air like that of an underground cellar. The children curled beneath thick blankets, shivering. As day and night blurred together, they began to understand that their home was no longer simply a refuge. It felt like a giant coffin the winter had built around them, burying them beneath yards of snow and sealing them off from the world above. The silence grew increasingly frightening. Sometimes the entire cabin fell so still they could hear their own heartbeats. But then a sudden gust would lash the walls, making the whole family flinch. They didn't know how long the storm would last. They didn't know how deep the snow was. They didn't know whether the door would ever open again. In those moments, Sarah began to understand something profound. Isolation isn't just being alone, it's the feeling of being left behind by the world. The second day passed. Then the third. The snow still refused to stop. And as the oil lamp burned low, the darkness inside the cabin grew thicker than the storm outside. Sarah didn't know when she began to cry, only that she remembered her mother's gentle voice whispering in her ear. "Don't be afraid, sweetheart. We will survive this." But in the darkness, the words sounded less like reassurance and more like a fragile prayer cast into a frozen sky with no one to hear it. When the storm finally pulled away, the world outside was still nothing but white. The door was buried under so much snow that the family spent 2 hours digging before they could open even a small gap. Outside, everything was eerily still, as though the world had frozen along with them. As the first weak light leaked through, they realized the most terrifying truth. This had been only one storm out of 63 that would strike that winter. And this was only the second chapter of a survival journey that would last nearly half a year. Their home had become a white tomb once, and would become one many more times. But the Bennetts stood there, in the middle of the boundless snow, trying to keep their breath from vanishing into the merciless Dakota cold. The battle with winter had only just begun. When the first storm finally eased, and Sarah's family caught a long, trembling breath inside their tiny home. Still shivering under the cruel bite of the wind, they felt, for a fleeting moment, that disaster had passed them by. But in truth, it was only the prologue to a long, tightening chain of tragedies. The sky remained heavy with the color of lead, and the snow outside did not melt. Instead, it thickened with every hour, as though intent on burying whatever hope still lingered. In that fragile pause, people began to understand that survival depended not only on the thin wooden walls or the flicker of a fire, but on a far larger system, one they were about to discover had completely collapsed. Bad news did not arrive with bells, horns, or a messenger's shout. It arrived in silence. A silence deep, dense, and cold as the ice lying across the land. A handful of men from town, seizing a rare moment when the wind stopped screaming, risked their lives to follow paths half swallowed by snow, hoping to check the rail line and the telegraph wires. When they returned, their faces were pale as carved snow, and their wide-open eyes told a truth more chilling than the storm itself: Dakota was entirely cut off. The railroad, the town's pride, its lifeline, its single artery connecting this lonely settlement to the civilized world, had vanished beneath towering walls of snow, higher than a man could reach. No more clatter of metal, no engine's distant echo promising supplies on the way. Only a featureless white stretching to the horizon. They dug, and dug again, but each shovel met only deeper layers of snow, stacked so thickly it felt as though the earth itself meant to swallow every human effort whole. The telegraph fared no better. Wires snapped, poles broken, signal stations buried. Calls for help, plans for aid, any fragile hope of communication, all dissolved into the same muffled emptiness. The town had never felt so small, a speck drifting in an endless sea of ice, unseen, unheard, and unknown to the world beyond. Worse still, their food supply depended entirely on that same railroad. Every winter, they stored away what they could, but it was only enough for a few weeks. No one had imagined a scenario where the tracks would freeze, for months. No one had dreamed of a long winter, capable of draining the land and its people to the very bone. Yet here it was, and there was no backup plan, no second chance. Paralysis spread through the town faster than the cold. Children asked why the train hadn't come. The adults understood, but no one dared to answer. Families gathered what little remained: a bit of flour, a handful of beans, a few scraps of coal, a strip or two of dried meat. Each home checked its stores, and in every pair of eyes flickered the same fearful question: how long can this last? By the third day after the grim discovery, the town felt utterly changed. No laughter, no voices calling from one cabin to the next. People moved slowly, guarding every breath, every step, as if even the air needed rationing. It seemed the very world was shrinking, preparing for a trial whose length no one could guess. Isolation meant more than the loss of trains or telegraphs, it was the sensation of being abandoned. Cut off from every source of help, every chance at survival, moment by moment. In hurried meetings inside the shared storage shed, voices stayed low yet taut: if the snow doesn't melt, if the storms return, if the last of the food runs out, but none of these questions had answers. And each gust of wind that swept past seemed to whisper the same truth: this winter was far from over. Sarah's family, like every other family in town, understood they were up against more than cold and darkness. They were confronting absolute aloneness, the kind more terrifying than any storm. The shadow of despair crept quietly into their rooms, their meals, their restless sleep. Yet in that same moment, survival instinct began to rise with a force stronger than fear. Because human beings, no matter the circumstance, will always try to find a way to live. And just when they felt completely swallowed by the storm, compassion stirred like a faint lamp flame resisting the long night, warming strangers, drawing people toward one another. They did not know what waited ahead. But they did know one thing: alone, they would not last. Clinging to their small private stores would only hasten their downfall. And so began a new chapter, one where humanity itself became the only warmth strong enough to stand against a killing winter. And in that brutal landscape, with hunger and cold pressing against every door, every child, every fragile hope, a question slowly rose, one that every family would be forced to answer, to share, or to perish. From the moment the town slipped into the absolute silence of the snowstorm, no telegraph, no supply trains, no road open to the world, families on the frontier understood they were not merely cut off. They had been left to decide their own fate. And as the cold settled in like the most merciless ruler imaginable, a slow realization entered every thought: no one could survive this winter alone. That truth led to a turning point, painful, yet deeply human, the place where our story now continues. When the storm quieted just enough for people to hear the sound of their own breath again, the first cries for help rose from nearby homes. Through the endless white, through the snowbanks towering like fortress walls, the Bennett family heard a faint knock, so fragile it felt like the last desperate effort of someone begging for a chance to live. It was the Hendersons, a young couple with a 6-month-old baby. The door opened, and with it came an image Sarah would never forget: the young mother clutching her shivering child, her face drained of color, while the father could barely stand, his strength nearly gone. Patches of frozen snow clung to their clothes, proof of the brutal struggle they'd endured when their roof collapsed under the crushing weight of the storm. No explanations, no hesitation. Sarah's father pulled them inside at once, shutting the door against the wind that seemed ready to devour everything. In their tiny wooden shelter, the breath of 3 new souls joined the cold, fragile air, but it also brought with it something warmer than fire: human presence. And from that moment on, a small 12 by 14-foot cabin had to hold 9 people. Every breath, every soft movement, every heartbeat became as precious as the last flicker of a candle about to go out. Strangely, no one complained. No one felt crowded or burdened. Because here, survival was no longer a private possession. It was something that existed only when shared. Everyone understood one simple, brutal truth: keeping one another warm was better than dying cold and alone. In the nights that followed, Sarah and her family learned that unity wasn't a slogan, it was survival itself. Each person became a living source of heat, sitting close, wrapping themselves in every scrap of cloth, using the warmth of their bodies to fight back the cold sneaking in through every crack. The Henderson baby was passed gently from arm to arm, because if that tiny breath faltered, the blow would be too devastating for everyone to bear. In the corner, Mrs. Bennett quietly gave up her blanket for the young mother. Sarah's father split their meager stores. Some flour, a pinch of sugar, a handful of beans, even though he knew it pushed his own family closer to hunger. But he also knew that if anyone in the town died this winter, it would not be just a personal tragedy. It would be a sign of something far worse: that winter had managed to break the human spirit. As more people sought shelter, the cabin slowly became a refuge that everyone understood instinctively: if they reached it, they had a chance, no matter how slim. Some had lost their homes. Some were exhausted. Some had run out of food. Some had wandered blindly through the storm but found the Bennett's door only because of the faint glow slipping through its cracks. All of them arrived with the same look, despair, but not surrender. Each night, Sarah sat by the frost-blurred window, watching thick flakes crash against the glass as though trying to tear apart their tiny world. She heard children whimpering, adults muffling their sighs. Yet within the mix of sounds, one truth echoed clearly. No one was alone. Around the fire, every story shared became a lifeline, pulling them back from the edge of fear. They spoke of warm summers and tall grass, of the smell of ripening grain on the wind, of dreams they hoped to plant once winter finally released its grip. These stories did not melt the snow or calm the wind, but they kept their hearts from freezing. And most importantly, their presence for one another reminded them of something essential. They were still human, still capable of love, still capable of hope. Soon, their sharing grew beyond food or blankets. It became a kind of spiritual wealth, keeping their minds from being swallowed by the endless darkness outside. A crumb of bread divided 3 ways. A warm cup passed between cracked hands. A whispered encouragement, a gentle touch, a steady embrace, each became a small salvation. Though Dakota was cut off entirely from the outside world, a deeper truth was forming quietly within its frozen borders. The survival of any single family now depended on the compassion of the entire community. One night, when the wind screamed so violently it felt as though the house might tear itself loose from the ground, the Henderson baby began to cry and wouldn't stop. The young mother panicked, the child's face flushed, its body icy, and it could no longer nurse. The entire room froze, breathless. Then Mrs. Bennet adjusted the thin blanket, took the infant into her arms, and pressed it to her chest as if holding her own child from years long past. With her warmth, her patience, and the soft strength of a mother's love, she pulled the baby back from danger. As its cries slowly softened, tears spilled quietly across the room, as though they had all won another battle against winter. In a world that seemed built only of despair, the Bennets and their neighbors created something miraculous. They turned a cramped little cabin into the warm, beating heart of the entire settlement. And that warmth, fragile as it was, kept them from being swallowed by the snow. Because in the long winter of 1880, the cold could kill a body. But kindness could save a soul from despair. And this, unbelievably, was only the beginning. Harder tests, far harsher, far more relentless, waited just beyond the next storm, ready to show them that everything they had endured so far was only the first wave of a winter beyond imagination. But before we step into that next chapter, remember this. It was in these moments of sharing and solidarity that they laid the foundation for the survival of an entire community, a small victory, yet one bright enough to illuminate the darkest winter in American history. From the moment the town sank into the absolute silence of the blizzard. No telegraph, no supply trains, no road opening forward, frontier families understood they were not merely cut off from the world. They were left to decide their own fate. And in the moment when cold became the cruelest ruler, a slow realization crept into every thought: no one could survive this winter alone. That realization opened the way for a painful but deeply humane turning point, the part of the story we are about to enter. When the storm subsided just enough for people to hear their own breathing again, the first cries for help came from nearby houses. In the endless white, amid snowbanks towering like fortress walls, the Bennet family heard a faint knock, as if someone were using the last remnants of their breath to beg for a chance to live. It was the Hendersons, a young family with a 6-month-old baby. The door opened, and with it came an image Sarah would never forget. The young mother holding her shivering child, her face bluish, while the father was almost faint from exhaustion. Patches of frozen snow clung to their clothes, evidence of the life-and-death struggle when their roof had collapsed under the suffocating weight of thick snow. Without long explanations, without hesitation, Sarah's father immediately pulled them inside and shut the door against the wind that seemed ready to swallow everything. Inside the already small wooden cabin, the breath of 3 new arrivals blended into the cold yet humane air. And from that moment, a house barely larger than 12 by 14 feet had to hold 9 people. Each breath, each sound became as precious as the last warmth of a candle about to go out. Strangely, no one complained. No one felt discomfort or irritation. Because in such circumstances, life was no longer a personal possession but something that existed only when shared. Everyone understood a simple, harsh truth: warming one another was better than freezing to death alone. The nights that followed became a time when Sarah and her family learned that unity was not a slogan, but a survival instinct. Each person became a living source of heat, sitting close together, wrapping extra scarves, using their body heat to ward off the cold that tried to creep in through every crack. The Henderson baby was passed from hand to hand to keep it warm, because if its breath weakened, the psychological blow to everyone would be unbearable. In the corner, Mrs. Bennet quietly gave her blanket to the young mother. Sarah's father split their meager rations, the sack of flour, a little sugar, a few beans, even though he knew this decision would push his own family closer to severe shortage. But he also knew that if someone in town died that winter, it would not be merely a personal grief, it would signal something worse: that winter had broken the human spirit. As the number of temporary shelterers grew, the wooden house gradually became a refuge that everyone understood: if you reached it, you had a chance to live, however fragile. Some had lost their homes, some were exhausted, some had no food left, some had been lost in the storm but were fortunate to find their way to the Bennets by following the faint light through the crack in the door. All arrived in the same state, desperate but not giving up. Sarah sat by the window each night, watching thick snow strike the glass as if trying to tear apart their small world. She heard children sobbing, adults stifling sighs. But amid all those sounds, one thing stood out. No one was alone. In that small room, every story told by the fire became a rescue from spiritual collapse. They spoke of summers of tall green grass, of days when the wind carried the scent of ripening grain, of hopes to plant again when winter passed. Those stories did not melt the snow or stop the wind's howl, but they kept their hearts from freezing. And most importantly, each other's presence reminded them of a core truth: they remained human, still capable of love, still holding hope. Gradually, sharing transcended material limits. It became a kind of spiritual wealth, preventing minds from being swallowed by the months-long darkness. A crumb of cake was divided into 3. A cup of warm water passed from pair of cracked hands to another. A word of encouragement, a hug, a gentle touch, each became a vital piece. The Dakota town, though completely cut off from the outside world, was quietly forming a truth larger than any storm. The survival of each family depended on the compassion of the whole community. One night, when the wind screamed so fiercely everyone thought the house might be ripped from the ground, the Henderson baby began to cry without stopping. The young mother panicked, her child's face flushed, its body cold, and it could not nurse. The whole room held its breath. In that moment, Mrs. Bennet adjusted the thin blanket, took the infant into her arms, and pressed it to her chest as if holding her own child out of time. With her warmth and the softness of maternal care, she rescued the baby from danger. As its cries slowly subsided, everyone wept, as if they had won another victory over winter. In circumstances that seemed only despair, the Bennet family and their neighbors performed a miracle: they turned that cramped little house into the warm heart of the whole area. And that warmth, fragile as it was, kept them from being swallowed by the white snow. Because in the long winter of 1880, cold could kill the body, but compassion could save people from despair. And that was only the beginning of the next, harsher trials, more brutal, more savage, that would show them the ordeals they had faced so far were only the first wave of a winter beyond imagining. But before moving to that part, remember. In this moment of sharing and unity, they laid the foundation for the survival of an entire community, a small victory that lit the darkest American winter. All those cramped days in the little wooden house, the warmth of sharing, the stories kindled like the last flames, were just enough to carry people through each bone-chilling night. But even solidarity could not hide an increasingly clear truth: food was running out. The last sacks of flour hit bottom. Beans remained only in a few scattered handfuls. The Henderson baby sometimes nursed only a little thin warm water. Everyone understood that without finding more food, no matter how tightly they held each other, death would still creep into every corner of the home. It was at that moment that a grave decision was made, a decision that would push three men into a journey that walked the line between life and death. That day, the wind was quieter than usual, as if the storm that had just passed was holding its breath, preparing for the next rage. The sky was not clear, instead it was a gloomy white stretching to the horizon. Yet it was the only rare quiet the men could use before the new storm arrived. Sarah's father, together with two neighbors, Uncle Martin and Mr. James, met in a tiny kitchen that barely fit three standing men. They needed no many words. All understood. This trip was not to seek luck but to buy the town more time. "We must go," Sarah's father said, his voice hoarse and deep as if pressed by snow. No one objected. No one could. Sarah stood by the door, looking at her father's face in the dim light. He pulled on the thickest coat the family owned. Even if it was patched from wind, it remained the only shield between him and the lethal cold. Mrs. Bennet wrapped another wool scarf around her husband. Her hands trembled not from cold but from fear. Each wrap of the scarf was a silent prayer. As the three men prepared to leave, Sarah noticed they had tied ropes around their waists, the line stretching from one to the next. "So we won't get lost in the storm," her father said. But those words did little to ease her worry. They only made her understand more fully that they were stepping into a blank whiteness in which even one's shadow could vanish. The door opened. The wind attacked like a pack of hungry wolves lunging at prey. They bowed their heads, braced with each step, slowly swallowed by the dense sea of snow ahead. And as their figures disappeared completely, Sarah felt the house go empty, as if it had lost its last pillar. A 7-mile distance in normal conditions was a 1-hour walk and not worth remembering. But in the winter of 1880, those 7 miles were a life-or-death battle, where every step might be the last. The wind cut across their faces like sharp blades. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The snow lay so deep their feet sank with each step, dragging their exhausted bodies along. There were no markers to guide them. The world had been erased, leaving only a boundless white that could easily disorient a person. Mr. James, the oldest of the three, stopped many times because the wind hit his face so fiercely he could not open his eyes. But whenever he wanted to rest, the other two tightened the rope, reminding him that if one stood still, the storm would swallow the whole group. The familiar road to town had become an invisible maze. Whirling gusts of wind seemed intent on lifting them off the ground. They had to brace their hands against the snow to avoid being blown away. Each time, their frozen hands lost a bit more feeling. Time seemed to cease. Only the biting cold ate into their joints, breath thick as smoke, and hearts pounding to remind them they were still alive. When they reached the town, what they found was not salvation but the ghost of ruin. Houses were half buried in snow. Shop doors were blown open. Inside was nothing but empty shelves. Even the food depot, the place they had pinned their last hopes on, held only a tangle of torn sacks and the thin smell of flour rising from long empty bins. Yet amid the suffocating despair, they still found a little food. A few remaining sacks of flour tucked in a corner, beans hardened like stone, some moldy coffee, and a lumped bag of sugar. It was not much, not nearly enough to feed families for long, but it was a treasure in the endless winter. They gathered it all into a sack, tied it tight, and began the journey back. If on the way out they fought the storm to find life, on the way back they raced against time. For another blizzard was preparing to strike again. They felt the air grow heavy, the wind change, signs those who had lived years on the frontier could not mistake. And then the storm struck. This time it was fiercer, more vicious, as if punishing those who dared challenge its domain. Every step home was a battle. The sacks of food strapped to their chests grew heavy as stone, both hope and burden that drained their strength faster. At times they thought they had lost their way. The rope tightened, jerking fiercely as the wind fought them. Yet it was that rope, thin but steadfast, that held them together like a fragile lifeline of hope. Inside the Bennett family's small cabin, everyone held their breath and waited. Night fell, the wind intensified, and snow pounded the door like a funeral knock. Sarah sat close to the window, eyes wide, straining to see a figure emerge from the white sea, but she saw only darkness and whirling white vortexes. Only near midnight did a strong knock make everyone startle. The door burst open, and the three men fell in like logs, faces covered in snow, breath shallow. They carried their sack of provisions, wet, heavy, but still intact. The room exploded in emotion, not because they were safe, but because they had brought back hope. Sarah gripped her father's hand, feeling the fingers cold and stiff as stone. But in his eyes, despite exhaustion, there was light, the light of a man who knew he had just pulled his family from the jaws of the abyss. The journey to town that day not only saved the Bennett family, it also saved the group of neighbors sheltering with them. It became proof of an unchanging truth, whether in the long winter of 1880 or any frontier era, to survive a merciless nature, people must risk their lives for one another. And from that point, they understood clearly, this recent trip was only the first trial. For what awaited them, the storms that would follow, would make this journey seem easy by comparison. But that is the story of the next part, where hope and despair will continue to grapple until the final moments of that fateful winter. But even though that journey had brought hope, it was only enough to delay hunger for a brief moment. The next storm arrived sooner than anyone predicted, burying every path and plunging the town once again into darkness and cold. As the last thin bags of flour dwindled away, people began to realize that death did not come only from hunger, but from the very cold encircling them, layer by layer. And then they faced a brutal truth: the firewood and coal were gone. That was when the Bennett family and the remaining survivors had to find another way to keep warm, a way that seemed hopeless, yet became the very thing that saved their lives during the most terrible days of winter. As the winter dragged on into its third month, the cold was no longer a weather condition. It had become a living creature, an invisible yet relentless enemy. It slipped through every crack in the door, haunted every corner of the house, and touched human skin with icy, sinister fingers. To the point that simply placing a hand on the table made the skin cling to the freezing wood as though touching a sheet of frozen metal. In the Bennett family's small cabin, the flame inside the stove grew smaller each day. And every time they opened the stove door, they swallowed their fear. Only a few scraps of wood remained. Once those scraps burned away, the cold would pour in like a pack of ferocious wolves, unstoppable and merciless. On the last night with firewood, the whole family sat beside the stove, its small flame flickering like a leaf about to fall. Silence filled the room. No one dared speak the question lingering in every mind. Tomorrow, how will we survive? It was in that moment that Mr. James, the neighbor who had been sheltering with them, mentioned the old Mennonite technique, twisting straw into burnable cords to use in place of wood. Straw did not burn as strongly as timber, nor did it give a roaring fire, but if twisted tightly and packed firmly, it could burn long enough to keep a house from freezing over. It was the only fragile hope they had. The next morning, as pale gray light seeped through the cracks of the door, everyone stepped out to the barn, the only place where a few bundles of dry summer straw were still stored. Though the wind howled so fiercely they had to bend low just to move forward, they pulled each bundle of straw into the house as if dragging their own future away from death's grasp. Inside the small room, they spread the straw across the floor and, with hands cracked and reddened from the cold, began twisting the straw into long strands. What seemed like simple work revealed itself to be harsher than expected. The straw, sharp and rough, scraped against the fissures in their skin, making them bleed. But no one stopped. They knew that if they did not work, they would die. If they hesitated, the Henderson baby would be the first to fade away in the merciless cold. Sarah sat beside her mother, her small hands trembling with every movement, yet she still tried to twist each strand of straw. She could feel the toll in every motion, the pulling of her skin, the numbness in her fingertips, her breath forming thick white clouds that drifted before her face. Despite the pain, she kept going, because she knew she was holding the thread of survival for everyone in the house. From morning until night, they twisted straw, packed it, tied it, forming tight bundles as firm as small wooden logs. And when darkness fell, they burned the first bundle. It burned slowly, its flame weak but steady. It didn't flare up like wood, but it didn't sputter out like grass either. The entire house let out a quiet sigh. They had found something that could keep the fire alive for one more day. But that victory came with a price. Thick smoke from the straw filled the cabin, so dense and sharp it turned everyone's eyes red and watery. The baby cried because of the smoke, Mrs. Bennet coughed over and over, and the children had to sit low to the ground where the air was clearer. Yet among all the coughing, there were soft, relieved whispers. We made it through another night. Each bundle of straw became one more hour of survival. 1 bundle, 1 hour. 10 bundles, 1 night. And so they burned straw, made more straw, burned again, repeating the cycle like a sacred ritual of survival, not allowing a single minute to slip away. The cold outside did not ease. Some nights, the wind was so violent it made the whole cabin tremble as if it might be torn from the ground. Storm after storm swept across the land, adding new layers of snow to the roof, the windows, and every dream that struggled to stay alive. But inside, the small flame from the straw bundles burned on. A faint, persistent light, like the human heart in the face of hardship. Heavy days passed, the skin on their hands turning darker, bruised. The cracks grew deeper, and sometimes straw stuck to the blood dried in the creases of their fingers. Yet no one complained. The pain only reminded them that they were still alive, and still fighting to stay that way. There were moments when they felt they could not endure even a moment more. Especially when they burned the last bundle of the day, knowing that to make another one, they would have to face the cold again. But they looked at each other, at the hollowed faces, the sunken eyes, the cold gray skin, and they stood up again. Sarah remembered clearly one night when the wind screamed so wildly that both children and adults were trembling with fear. They sat close around the stove, burning their last bundle. Its flame was so small Sarah thought it might go out at any second. But it burned to the very end, refusing to yield to the cold, just as they refused to yield to their circumstances. The room was silent as they watched the straw bundle burn down. Just as the flame was about to die, Sarah's father cupped his hand around it, trying to hold on to every last hint of warmth. The heat scorched his skin, but he did not move. When the flame finally vanished, he spoke only one sentence. "Tomorrow, we'll make more straw." And the next day, they did. Despite the pain, despite the cold, despite the moments when they felt utterly drained, they kept going. In the most merciless stretch of the long winter, when the cold became an undefeatable enemy, those crude little bundles of straw turned into miracles. The straw was not just fuel, it was a symbol of perseverance, proof of humanity's ability to find hope in what seemed worthless. Thanks to those bundles of straw, the Bennet family, and the neighbors sheltering with them, survived the coldest nights of their lives. Not because they had much, but because they refused to give up. And from that fragile flame, they stepped into the next chapter of the longest winter in history, a chapter where nature had not yet finished testing them, where storms would continue to fall without mercy. But with perseverance and resilience forged through every twisted strand of straw, they were ready to confront the greater trials still waiting ahead. And then, when the last bundles of straw had turned to ash, when the rare warmth had barely brushed against their frozen fingertips, the sky began to change again. The wind rose, howling in sharp, broken cries like warnings torn straight from the air. The people of the frontier knew that sign all too well. There was no time for hope, no room for weary shoulders to rest, because that winter was not only long, but so merciless that it refused to let anyone stand firm for even a moment. And so, like a dark refrain repeating endlessly without pause, the storms returned. When one storm finally passed, it seemed the sun might grant the land a fleeting breath of peace. But it did not. The winter of 1880 to 1881 had been marked, as if by fate, to become a relentless chain of nature's cruelty. One storm had barely begun to fade when the next came roaring behind it, as though the sky itself were competing to unleash its fiercest fury upon those already brought to their knees. Snow no longer fell in delicate flakes but in great, torn sheets, like shreds of white cloth hurled into the air. The wind lashed so violently that people believed a single misstep could send them spinning into a void of endless white. Windows shuddered. Roofs groaned. Thin columns of smoke from the stoves were beaten down by the wind, unable to rise straight into the sky. And amid such a scene, the frontier families began to feel the most terrifying truth drawing near: hunger. In the early days of the long winter, food was scarce, but at least there was still something left. They still had milk, flour, potatoes saved from the summer harvest, strips of salted meat hanging in the loft. But as each storm arrived, each lasting for days, everything began to run out at a speed no one dared imagine. The flour dwindled to a few small handfuls. Potatoes turned black with frost. Salted meat grew dry and hard, some pieces frozen so solid they could not be chopped. To stretch their survival, they divided the food into portions so small they barely resembled meals at all: a slice of bread thin as paper, a piece of potato no larger than a fingertip. The children cried, not out of mischief, but out of hunger. The adults stayed silent, not because they were strong, but because if they spoke, they feared they might break down in front of their children. During those days, despair did not flood in suddenly. It seeped slowly, deeply, like cold rising from the soles of one's feet into the chest. Some families went 2 full days without eating, drinking only a few spoonfuls of melted snow just to keep their throats warm. Some mothers secretly handed their portions to their children, pretending they had already eaten, pretending they were not hungry. Others no longer had the strength to lie. And the most frightening part, no one knew how long the storms would last. If the storms stopped tomorrow, they could endure. If they stopped next week, there might still be hope. But as storm followed storm, that moment of stopping drifted farther away, like the sun, hidden behind a curtain of endless white. At night, the little house became a cold, silent box. The wind moaned through the cracks like the weary sighs of a giant trapped in the dark. Families huddled close, trying to share enough warmth to keep the youngest children from shaking. Sometimes the door thudded violently under the force of the wind, and the father would jump up to brace it with another wooden beam before it could be torn from its hinges. In those long nights, sleep became a rare luxury. People only closed their eyes when their bodies drifted past the edge of exhaustion. But even in sleep, they felt the hunger. It gnawed not only at their stomachs, but at the last threads of their will. Records from that time tell of families who ground up seed grain. The precious kernels meant for spring planting, to make a thin flour to survive another day. A desperate act, for eating meant surviving today, but dying of hunger when spring arrived. Yet in the blinding cold and the emptiness of their bellies, spring became a dream too distant to matter. In places where the storms were fiercest, the wind swept entire granaries clean, scattering seed grain into the snow. People found kernels frozen into solid clumps, cold as stone. Still, they bent down and picked up every grain they could find, as though gathering tiny fragments of hope itself. But the storms did more than starve the people. They loosened their grip on time. For many weeks, no one knew what day it was, for everything outside was the same endless white. There was no sun to measure the hours. No neighbors visiting to exchange news. No trains, no telegraph signals. The world shrank into 4 walls and the dim, wavering glow of an oil lamp. Isolation twisted the senses. Some said they heard knocking on the door in the middle of the night, but when they opened it, there was only the wind. Others thought they heard their names whispered from within the screaming blizzard. These sounds were never recorded in official history, but they lived on in the memories of those who survived that merciless winter. When hunger reached its peak, human spirits grew faint. Some collapsed, lying motionless for hours. Some stared blankly at the wall of snow outside the window, as though waiting for something to appear from that lifeless white. Many families began to speak of the nameless fear, a quiet dread that this winter might never end. But in that darkest moment, something strange happened. The will to survive grew stronger. People began to calculate more carefully. They began to share more generously. They revived old stories, old songs, old prayers. Because when the storms took everything, food, light, time, the one thing nature could never take from them was hope. And in the endless storms, that tiny hope kept them from falling into despair. The hunger of the long winter of 1880 to 1881 recorded more than nature's brutality, it revealed the extraordinary endurance of frontier families. They had no modern technology, no relief systems, no comforts to rely on. They had only one another, only their instinct to survive. And that was enough to make them symbols of resilience. Though storm followed storm, though the cold tried to crush every breath, they endured. They kept their fire, small, fragile, but alive, burning within. And because of that fire, they passed through the harshest months of winter. So when the final storms dissolved and the sky finally opened, they understood they had survived a trial few generations could ever imagine, a trial of hunger, despair, and unbroken will. When the storms continued one after another without end, when the roofs across town trembled beneath the weight of that merciless winter, and when all that remained to eat were handfuls of coarse flour ground from barley as hard as stone, people began to feel, with haunting clarity, that the line between life and death had thinned to a single fraying thread. Those days of hunger that hollowed the breath, those nights so cold they pierced the bones. All of them pressed together into an invisible weight that settled heavily upon the entire community. And then, on a gray, smoky morning, when the smell of burning straw hung in their tired breaths, they understood, if they kept holding out like this, the whole town would perish. And in that fragile moment, the only hope, so faint it felt almost unreal, began to glimmer. A small rumor, but one powerful enough to warm more deeply than any fire surviving in the long winter outside. The rumor came from a horse trader who had once passed through the southern ridge. He said that about 15 miles from town, a farmer still had more than 60 sacks of wheat stored away. No one knew for certain whether it was true, or merely the desperate whisper of a man too cold and hungry to know dream from reality. But in times like these, even the most fragile hope was worth more than gold. And the chance, thin as the frost clinging to window panes, was enough to stir a quiet determination in the hearts of the people. But the greatest question was, who would go? 15 miles in the winter of 1880 were nothing like 15 miles in any other season. They were 15 miles of white hell. 15 miles of wind strong enough to overturn breath itself. 15 miles where visibility shrank to a few steps, where a person could vanish in a single sweeping gust. It was a journey even the strongest men hesitated to take. They knew that if they went, they might never return. If they didn't, then surely everyone would die. In that heavy silence, two young men rose. Almanzo Wilder, quiet, steady, strong in a way that didn't need to be announced, and Cap Garland, quick, stubborn, fearless like a river that had never met a stone it couldn't break. No one called for volunteers. No one appointed them. They stood simply because a truth had settled into their hearts: if no one did this, then nothing would remain to save. There were no grand speeches. No applause. No bold farewells. Only eyes, grateful, trembling, deeply afraid, watching them as they prepared to leave town. Each wrapped in layers of clothing already stiffened by the cold. Strips of cloth bound around their arms and legs to keep the blood from freezing. A small sled dragged behind them, a fragile hope that it would one day carry sacks of grain back home. That was all, a simple preparation for a task that seemed impossible. When they stepped beyond the edge of town, snow curled upward around their feet as if trying to swallow them immediately. The wind howled so fiercely it pushed their bodies sideways. Frost clung to their eyelashes until every blink burned like a cut. But they walked on. They had nothing but courage and the quiet drive of survival pushing them forward. The journey lasted longer than a single day. Through the endless white landscape, they moved as though wandering a world without color, without paths, without sound, only heartbeats and breaths turning to mist. Whenever the wind surged, they had to stop, bend low to the ground, tie themselves together so they wouldn't be blown away like dry leaves. Their hands stiffened beneath their gloves, until they could no longer tell where their fingers ended and the frozen fabric began. At times, they dug through snow with bare hands to find the way. At times, they crawled, because standing meant being swept into nothingness. And sometimes, in that vast, silent ocean of white, they felt like nothing more than two faint shadows wavering between worlds. But they did not turn back. Not once. When at last they found the farmer, himself half broken by the same winter, they were too exhausted to speak. They only pointed at the sacks of wheat. The man understood immediately. And although his own supplies were far from plentiful, he agreed to sell. Perhaps he, too, understood that saving these two was saving an entire town. The journey home was harsher still. The wind stronger, the frost thicker, the cold clinging like a living creature trying to freeze each joint into stillness. 2 sacks of wheat, heavy as hope itself, were tied to the sled, but dragging them through snow that rose nearly to their knees was a trial enough to bring any man to collapse. Sometimes the sled overturned, the sack sinking into the snow, and they had to dig with bare hands again, 10 fingers burning so sharply they could no longer tell if they were flesh or cracking ice. And then, after days no one could keep count of, they returned. No one ever forgot that moment. 2 staggering silhouettes emerging from the pale curtain of frost. Their faces blue, their skin fused to stiff cloth. Some fingers no longer whole. Their ears bleeding from frostbite. But behind them, the 2 sacks of wheat, more precious than anything in the world then, remained intact. The whole town ran toward them. No words came. Emotion rose so warm and sharp in their throats that it melted the frost inside their hearts. The 2 young men had not only brought back wheat. They brought faith. They brought hope. They brought proof that even in the cruelest winter, human beings could still do the impossible. The journey of Almanzo and Cap did more than save a dying town. It became a symbol of courage, of the quiet strength people find when standing at the edge of life and death. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people can do the most extraordinary things, when their faith is strong enough, and their heart steady enough to keep walking even when the world around them is nothing but desperate white. And because of that, with the small flame of hope rekindled, the townspeople found the strength to face the final weeks of winter. Though they would be harsher than anything they had endured before. Even when the train of hope had finally begun to move, even when the 2 young men returned alive with news of salvation, the people of the Dakota town still could not breathe a sigh of relief. Because between the promise and the reality, the blizzards continued to roar, burying every road, every wish. And in that time, those days suspended between hope and death, the community had to face an ordeal even more brutal. The complete exhaustion of everything that had once held them close to life. There are moments in a person's life when even hope becomes a luxury. For the pioneer families in Dakota that winter, the time after the 2 boys left town was the beginning of such a period, a stretch of days in which every passing hour was a struggle to hold on to the last wisp of breath. At first, they reminded themselves that no matter how fierce the blizzards, no matter how deeply the railway tracks were buried, the relief train would come. But as the days and then the weeks drifted by in the freezing wind, that hope dimmed into a trembling flame. Its light was too faint to brighten the dark house, yet just bright enough to keep them from letting go. The town was nearly out of food. Families shared what they had left, tiny portions of bread, spoonfuls of flour. But soon, even the flour was gone. Meals became small cakes ground from barley grains so coarse they hurt to chew. Meat? Long gone. Sugar and coffee survived only in memory, luxuries the children sometimes spoke of as if describing a dream. The home of Sarah Bennett and of the families sheltering with hers had grown so empty that they could hear the wind screaming through the tiniest cracks. It was not the sound of wind slipping past a doorframe, but the sound of wind tearing through the very soul. A cold that did not simply bite the skin but seeped into the flesh, the breath, the mind. A cold that made one imagine turning slowly to stone. Each morning, they woke not only to live another day, but to count what remained. That could still be burned for heat. First it was wood, then coal. When both were gone, they turned to things no one ever imagined they would burn, wood from tables, chairs, bed frames, old window slats. Their home gradually thinned into a skeleton. Every piece thrown into the fire was a piece of their past, something once cherished, now sacrificed. But the most frightening thing was not the hunger, nor the cold. It was the darkness. The oil lamps were empty. No light remained in the house except the small flame in the stove, when there was anything left to burn. Whenever the fire died, the entire room sank into a darkness thick as velvet, a darkness that made the world feel as though it had vanished. The children cried in fear. The adults pulled them close, comforting them with stories whispered through trembling, exhausted voices. Day and night lost all meaning. Time became a single, endless ribbon of dim hours, stitched together by the sound of wind straining against the wooden walls. And then even the last pieces of wood burned to ash. Families turned to straw, bundles once meant for livestock. But the livestock? Long dead. The cows frozen, the chickens stiff, the pigs turned to icy statues in their pens. They fell as silently as stone. Thus, the straw became the only thing keeping the people alive, though it had been meant for the spring planting. But by then, no one thought of spring. Every hour lived was a small miracle. Twisting straw into ropes for burning was no easy task. Straw was too thin, too dry, too quick to turn to flame. To make it last, they had to twist it tightly, tighter and tighter, until their wrists ached, until their palms cracked and bled, until their fingers grew numb with cold. Strangely, everyone worked in silence. No complaints. No bitterness. Because each tightly twisted rope of straw was an hour of life. Whenever the fire flared, just for a few minutes, the whole house glowed like a sliver of heaven. They warmed their hands, their faces, toasted their hard barley cakes. They sat close together, drawing strength from each other like small, fragile creatures fighting against the vast, merciless winter. But then the coffee grinder, the last tool that could grind the grain, broke. Split in two like a blow to their remaining hope. They resorted to 2 stones, wrapped in cloth, grinding the barley grain by hand. The scraping of the stones was dry and sharp, like the winter itself. By then, their strength was nearly gone. Every step inside the house made them dizzy. The children's faces had turned pale, their lips cracked, their eyes shadowed. Some sat still for hours, not speaking, not because they were obedient, but because they were too weak even to cry. The adults were just as drained. At times, someone would fall asleep sitting upright, not a peaceful sleep, but a fainting from exhaustion. Each time someone's eyes stayed closed a little too long, the others had to shake them awake, terrified they might never open them again. On the fiercest storm days, the wind wailed across the roof like the cries of wandering spirits. The house trembled, the boards groaned. In those moments, everyone sat still, hand in hand, waiting. Not waiting for the storm to end, but waiting to see whether the house would hold. When hope became too distant to reach, all they could do was cling to one another. Believe in one another. Believe that if they endured each gust, each hour of hunger, each breath of freezing air together, perhaps a miracle would come. And in those darkest days, something small and strange happened. something that survivors would later remember as a soft spark of light in the cruel winter's memory. The sound of a bell. At first very faint, like metal tapping against metal somewhere far away within the storm. Then louder. And when everyone rushed to the window, hearts pounding, hands trembling, they saw, through the swirling curtain of snow, a warm yellow glow. A train. Not an illusion. Not a dream. Not a fragile hope anymore. A reality. What happened next? The barrels of flour, the sacks of wheat, the crates of salted meat, the men from the train rushing out to distribute supplies. That part is the history everyone remembers. But few recall that just before that moment, the entire community had reached the final edge of exhaustion, of breathing out the last bit of life, where just a few more days, a few more storms, might have laid the whole town silently beneath the endless white. They survived not because of food, not because of fire, but because of one thing alone. The unyielding resilience of human beings standing at the brink. And that long winter, harsh beyond measure, proved that even when everything is gone, even when hope is no more than a fragile flicker, people can still hold on, keep it alive, and continue living. And then, in the very moment when people felt they had reached the final edge of their endurance, when every breath had become a long, drawn-out struggle, and when most of the pioneer families had nearly lost all faith, something quiet and miraculous began to unfold. It came without fanfare, without noise, without warning. Just small, very small changes, yet enough to stir hearts that had nearly gone cold. And from that fragile place where despair and hope touched, the story moved into its last chapter, the chapter of rebirth. The final weeks of the long winter were like walking upon a blade. Each morning, when the survivors opened their eyes, they did not know whether the white sky outside their window signaled the beginning of hope or the next, inevitable ending. But then, one morning, so softly that no one truly trusted their own senses, the wind shifted. It no longer howled like the scream of a demon. It no longer tore at the walls or pounded on every wooden plank as though trying to rip the houses apart. The wind grew gentler, less vicious, like a wild beast finally exhausted after months of roaring. And in that instant, the pioneers felt something they had waited for through half a year. Winter, at last, was letting go. At first, they didn't dare believe it. Hope, in times like these, was a luxury. But when sunlight appeared, after weeks of hiding behind storm clouds, spilling softly across rooftops heavy with snow, everything became unmistakably clear. The light wasn't warm yet, but it was real. It wasn't the illusion of someone trembling from hunger, nor the tangled dream of a soul lost between day and night. It was the first step toward change. And then, as though nature had decided to return everything at once, the ice began to crack. Not with thunderous sounds, but with faint, crisp noises, like glass tapping lightly somewhere beneath the snow. Those cracks spread, first slowly, then faster, stronger, until the white earth started to tighten and shrink, revealing patches of dark soil hesitant beneath the sunlight. For the frontier families, that was more than a sign of spring. It was confirmation that they had survived. As the temperature rose, snow melted from the roofs in thin streams. The soft dripping sound, so ordinary in other years, was the most beautiful music the town had heard in months. It seeped through every window pane, flowed into every room, whispering that the pain, the storms, the long freezing nights were now slipping into memory. The pioneer families began to open their doors. For many months, they had not dared step outside without fear of being swallowed in an instant. But now, they stood on their thresholds and drew deep breaths of the cool air that carried the quiet promise of renewal. Though still hungry, still weak, still trembling, their eyes now held something winter could not steal, faith. The children, thinner and paler than before, still ran toward the falling water dripping from the roofs. They reached out their small hands to catch it, laughing, an echo of joy that had survived only in memory for so long. The adults simply stood in silence, watching the sky clear, watching the sun grow stronger each day, feeling warmth slowly awaken in their bodies, and knowing that the harshest struggle of their lives had finally reached its end. But surviving the winter was not only a triumph of endurance. It was a triumph of resilience. For every last pot of grain they shared, every bundle of straw they twisted for heat, every daring journey through the storm, every act of kindness between neighbors, all of it bound them together, strengthening them in ways even the fiercest forces of nature could not undo. And when spring returned, they looked back on those bleak months not only with horror, but with a deep, quiet pride. A pride in knowing that they, small, fragile humans standing against a vast wilderness, had prevailed with their own hands, their own hearts, their unwavering spirits. In the weeks that followed, the railway tracks were dug out. The telegraph lines were restored. The first trains emerged through the morning haze carrying food, medicine, and news from a world they had nearly been cut off from. People lined the tracks, waving with emotion, as though the train carried not just supplies but rebirth itself. Bolivia, De Smet, and the small towns along the railroad never forgot that winter. It was the longest, the cruelest, and also the one that taught them the deepest lesson about human endurance. On the first clear day, when warm winds swept across grassland still patched with snow, the townsfolk gathered outside their homes, newly freed from months of burial. They didn't need to say much. They simply looked at one another, smiled, and felt their hearts beat strong in their chests, proof that they were still here, still standing. And so, spring returned not merely as a change in weather. It came as a marker of victory. Victory of resilience, of compassion, of the quiet strength that had carried them through the days when even nature itself seemed determined to test them to the limit. In the history of America, the long winter of 1880 to 1881 remains one of the most brutal periods ever recorded. But for the pioneer families who lived through it, that winter was not only a disaster. It was proof that when people stand together with courage and resolve, they can overcome anything, even the fury of the earth itself. And when the first wildflowers pushed up through the thawing soil, they understood. Life always returns. Hope always returns. And human beings, no matter how small, can always rise from the wreckage and begin again. The long winter of 1880 was not just a weather event, it was a harsh trial for the courage and endurance of the pioneer families. They had walked through darkness, through ice, through days that felt utterly hopeless, only to prove that human beings can stand stronger than any storm. And in that very journey of survival, we glimpsed the greatest values of all, unity, the will to keep living, and a quiet, unwavering hope that no hardship can extinguish. If this story has stirred your heart, then know that there are countless other journeys of survival, untold stories, simple yet extraordinary lives, waiting for you to discover them. Each story is a slice of history, a mirror reflecting the hidden strength that lies within every human being. Stay with the channel, so you won't miss the emotional journeys, the lessons from the past, and the stories that might touch your heart in ways only history can. Because sometimes, just a single story is enough to warm an entire winter within the soul.